Okay, good afternoon everyone, and thank you so much Bibiana for that lovely introduction, and Aileen for the awarding of the medal. It's hard for me to articulate what it means to get this award today and to be here speaking to you, because I've admired the work of Alone for so many years, and when I was a practitioner it was such a core part of the services that we drew on, so it really does mean a lot to me. I'd also like to really thank the Irish Gerontological Society Association. This has been an amazing conference. There's been such vibrancy, such energy, and I think I've been so struck by the quality but also the enormity of the research going on, many by practitioner researchers, frontline practitioners who in their very busy lives are still finding time to carry out research. So I really want to commend you on that, and it really does help to serve the older people that we're all trying to benefit. But for today, I'm going to be talking, as Aileen said and Bibiana in her introduction, on ageism, human rights and growing old with dignity, which is a topic that's very close to my own heart. Okay, so before we get into the nitty-gritty, and thank you everyone for hanging into the bitter end as well, because I know it's been a very intense programme, I really want you to take a moment. I want you to stop, and I really want you to take off your professional hats, whether that's as a doctor, a social worker, an OT, a physio, a researcher, and really just think about what it means. Firstly, are you looking forward to growing old and old age? Maybe a bit of a loaded question and contentious, but I think it's really important that we start to connect with our own personal ageing when talking about ageism and human rights. But I also want you to think about what would growing old with dignity look like for you, and is that positive and is that achievable at the moment within our current context. I suppose for me, ageing is very much a universal human experience, not only in the context of our own personal ageing, but also within the context of our parents, our families, our friends, our wider communities, and also wider society. I always talk to my social work students about this. We've got some really lively discussions in terms of what it means to be old, and I've had some very interesting discussions around that, but also I suppose that universal aspect of ageing. So look, we mightn't all get married, we mightn't all get children, but with every breath we take we are all getting older and ageing, and hopefully in time we'll grow to be older. So I think it's again really important that we hold that thought working through today. Okay, so today I'm going to try and talk a little bit about population ageing, just in terms of context, then moving on to the whole issue of ageism, what we mean by that, how it manifests itself, and then looking at the whole issue of upholding and protecting the human rights of older people, both globally and then more specific to the Irish context. And really I'm doing that around three kind of core pillars. I want to look at how we support our older people, but I also want to look at the intersection between our older people and our family caregivers, because again, I think that is of critical importance. I think our recent care referendum, if anything, has shown us that we cannot look at different sectors of the population in isolation, and that interdependency lens is absolutely paramount. I mean, I think just to touch on the care referendum, I think it also is a real hopeful thing in terms of we've seen our people with disabilities across the country mobilise, collectively advocate, and again, I'll talk about that a little bit later on in terms of what that can offer us. I'm also focusing on the issue of protection within that support kind of dialogue, and then finally I want to finish up at looking at what might help going forward. So before I start, I think it's important to position myself. Obviously, I'm a social worker. It's part of my professional mandate to be concerned with human rights, with social justice, but I would also very much define myself and identify as a critical gerontologist. What that means is that I take a sociological approach to ageing and very much understanding that ageing is ideologically constructed. Coming from this perspective, it very much encourages us to question that dominant biomedical model of ageing and that overwhelming burden narrative that often we're faced with in our own conversations, but also within our popular media and our policy discussions. Instead, critical gerontology really encourages us to think and recognise the valuable contributions of our older people, what they contribute to our families, to societies, but also to consider the historical, the demographic and the socio-cultural aspects of ageing. And again, starting from this perspective, it very much rejects that focus on decline, illness and disability of older people, and again really looks to the contribution that our older people make, whether that's in the creative arts in terms of writing, music, or indeed at a very local level in terms of our own families and supporting childcare and families. Okay, so moving on to population ageing. We know that people worldwide are living longer, and again, something to really celebrate. Today, most people can expect to live into their 60s and beyond. Again, every country globally in the world is experiencing a growth both in the size and the proportion of older people within the population. And in 2020, for the first time in human history, we saw the number of people over 60 outnumber those under 5. So again, something to really celebrate. But in terms of this infographic, and again, I chose this infographic purposefully, I suppose first to point out in 2015, sorry, I probably should be doing this up here. In 2015, we expect that 1 person in 3 will be over the age of 65, and also 1 person in 10 will be over the age of 80. But again, we can see it draws attention to Japan, Ireland and Cyprus face the largest jump in ageing costs over the next decade. Again, we're seeing this kind of negative narrative creep in here. Again, at the bottom, between now and 2050, the fiscal burden of the crisis will be 10% of the ageing-related costs. So again, why is this growth in population development being framed in such negative terms? I mean, it would be naive to not acknowledge that all societies do face challenges in terms of ensuring that our health and social care systems are ready to make the most of this demographic shift. However, the ageing of societies around the world is frequently portrayed negatively, and the perception that ageing society represents a burden is very much entrenched in much of our current policy making. Okay, so again, a few more demographics. This is from the Institute of Public Health, and again, we can see that by 2050, in both the north and south of Ireland, we can expect that nearly a quarter of the population will be aged over 65. In terms of our projections, again, we can see that kind of outline. This is from Census 2022 data, and again, significant increases in all of our older cohorts as we move towards 2057. But I think some of the challenges that we need to kind of think about is there is no typical older person. Again, we see huge diversity with our older people, and age is not random, so we really need to think about the person and environment approach and the impact that some of people's physical and social environments, how these impact both on opportunities, but also on health and behaviours. So we know that if people can experience these extra years of life and good health, if they live in a supportive environment, their ability to do the things that they want to do, that they love, that they value, will be very different to that of a younger person. However, if these years are dominated by declines in either physical or mental health or well-being, the implications for older people, their family caregivers and wider society are more negative or more challenging. And again, we really need to think about our public health responses and planning and how these must address this wide range of older people's experiences and needs. So one size does not fit all. Again, I really wanted to bring the whole issue of carers on our carer population into this conversation, because while this graph, again from Census 2022, looks at the increases in carer population across all age cohorts, we do know that we have increasing numbers of older carers. And again, I suppose this is a consideration, because when we talk about older people, many of our carers are also older people themselves, so they must be part of this conversation. So kind of building on that, again, look, how do we define a carer? And I'm sure most of you are aware of this, but a carer can generally be defined as a person who cares unpaid for either a family or for either a friend or a family member who, due to illness, disability, a mental health issue, or perhaps an addiction, cannot cope without their support and care. Again, from the previous graph, we know that those aged 50 to 59 are most likely to provide regular unpaid care, but overall we've seen over a 50% increase in the numbers of family carers, with 30% of them providing 43 hours of care or more a week, which is a huge amount. Again, increasing numbers of older carers, and Family Carers Ireland has estimated that our unpaid family carers save the state approximately 22 billion per annum, so a huge amount of money. So there are economic issues here at play as well. Again, just to go back to the more global context, I forgot to mention Eurocarers would estimate that 80% of all care across Europe is provided by unpaid family caregivers. So this isn't a situation that's unique to the Irish context. And again, some of the key drivers around this are around the ageing profile of our populations, but also growing numbers of working adults with long-term health conditions, the impact of neoliberalism on healthcare services, but also the reduced use of institutional care. So that move towards ageing in place and that principle is absolutely very important and something we want to aspire to. But again, we have to look at what that looks like and where is that care coming from and who is providing it. Okay, so the very thorny and important topic of ageism, and again, that has cropped up over the last few days in many of our conversations and discussions after presentations, and I think that was, again, very encouraging. So look, firstly, ageism is not only a biological process, but again, it is socially constructed, and ageism can occur at many levels for older people. Again, we can kind of define ageism as the social processes whereby negative images and attitudes towards older people based solely on the characteristics of age itself result in some form of discrimination. The global report, again, we can see this first infographic here, has indicated that 1 in 2 people are ageist. And again, interestingly, talk about age stereotypes can be internalised by children as young as 4. So again, I'm going to go back to that life course kind of point in terms of this isn't just about older people. We really need to think about all generations when we're talking about ageism. And again, we know that many of our younger people also experience ageism. I think Simone de Beauvoir put it very well when she talked about society's attitude towards the old being deeply ambivalent. I would also argue, I think our politicians and sometimes our policymakers' attitudes are also deeply ambivalent, and that's something that should be and is a concern to us. Again, the World Health Organization have really, I suppose, catapulted a lot of initiatives around this, highlighted this as a critical issue globally, and have very much recognised, they would argue that ageism is now a more pervasive form of discrimination than either sexism or racism, and that it is so deeply embedded and so pervasive that even those who outwardly express the best of intentions may have difficulty avoiding negative actions and expressions. And again, look, I'm guilty myself. I think we are so unaware of how deeply embedded it is in our conversations, in our thought processes, that we really need to kind of explicitly draw attention to it. I suppose another important aspect of ageism is the whole issue of self-directed or internalised ageism that many of our older people experience. So this is where people internalise ageist opinions that they've been repeatedly exposed to over the course of their lives. Again, self-directed ageism can very much result in older people conforming to society's age stereotypes, which can then negatively impact on their physical and mental health. Okay. So, moving on to looking specifically to ageism in Ireland. So again, we know that age is often used to both categorise but also to divide people in ways that lead to harm, disadvantage, injustice, and it very much erodes solidarity across our generations. And this is ageism. So ageism is the stereotypes, so how we think. It is prejudice, so how we feel. It is discrimination, how we act towards others or ourselves based on age. Again, Age Action have been doing some lovely work around this in terms of their Reframing Ageing report. And in 2022, they surveyed 1,849 members of the general public. Again, survey respondents were asked to respond to 7 ageist kind of statements and to indicate whether they agreed or disagreed with them. Again, the findings from this survey indicated that 1 in 4 Irish people have experienced some type of age discrimination. And again, younger people, according to this survey, are more likely to hold ageist opinions. So again, that was kind of indicated to be those in the 18 to 34 age bracket. Interestingly, again, according to the survey, men are more likely to hold ageist opinions, with the survey indicating that nearly half of men, or 47%, agreed with 2 or more ageist statements in comparison to only kind of a quarter, or 28% of women. So again, not going to go into the kind of analysing that, but I think there's definitely some food for thought there. Okay, so moving on to our international policy framework, and again, I don't want to go into this in a huge amount of detail, but I think it is important to kind of note that since the early 1980s, there has been coordinated efforts to incorporate concerns about older people into the wider United Nations agenda. In 1982, the International Plan of Action was adopted by the World Assembly on Ageing in Vienna, and then more recently in 1991, we saw the implementation of the International Plan of Action on Ageing and related activities, which then included the United Nations Principles for Older Persons. And again, that kind of is still our overarching soft legislative policy framework at the more international level. However, we have, I think, encouragingly seen a resurgence in the conversations and advocating for the need for a UN Convention for older people within the context of older people's human rights. So again, what do we mean by human rights? Human rights are rights that we have simply because we all exist as human beings. They are not granted by any state per se. These universal rights are inherent to us all. So they can range from the most fundamental, so whether that's the right to life, but it can also be some of those human rights that make life worth living or enjoyable. So such as the right to food, the right to education, the right to work, the right to health, the right to liberty. And again, these are very much universal rights. But within that, there's moral obligations around these rights, and they're both dynamic and complex. And again, we have seen many legal scholars now kind of pose the question, should older people be treated as adults, or indeed as a separate group in need of special protections under the law? For me, I think COVID-19 very much shed a light on many of those kind of pre-existing structural inequalities for our older people, and very much amplified the need for increased protections for our older generations, not just here in Ireland. Again, I would say that that's very much globally. And again, it's been argued that the older population remain a vulnerable group with no legal instrument specifically tailored to its needs. So again, I would ask, we have a UN Convention for the Rights of Children. We have a UN Convention for the Rights of People with Disabilities. Why do we not have a UN Convention for our older people? But as I said, we're seeing some small signs of encouragement. So the Global Alliance for the Rights of Older People have been doing fantastic work at the level of to really advocate and progress this kind of mandate for a specific UN convention. And in August this year, we saw most jurisdictions kind of vote and agree that this was an issue of concern globally, and that progression towards a UN convention for older people would be, there was a commitment there to continue to progress that. Okay, so look, I really wanted to now take a moment to think about and to focus on, are human rights for older people being upheld in Ireland currently, and what does that look like? In the interest of time, I can't go into each one of the United Nations principles, which I said is kind of very much our overarching international policy framework, but I do want to focus on the first point in terms of the first principle around the benefit that older people should benefit from family and community care and protection in accordance with society's system of cultural values. I want to focus specifically on protection, and for me, we have significant gaps in our ability to protect our older people who may be vulnerable to abuse or neglect. We have had a number of scandals in Ireland, which I'm not going to go into analysis in detail about. We've had the Emily case, we've had the Brandon case, but we also have a situation where social workers in Ireland do not have a legal right of entry to private dwellings, to private nursing homes. We do not have primary adult safeguarding legislation to protect our older people. We have a fantastic domestic violence bill, 2018, which introduced the crime of coercive control within the context of intimate relationships for the first time in Irish history, but that legislation did not extend to our older people within the context of coercive control, for example, between an older adult, so a parent, and their adult child. And again, we have little or no research around this, but we know that this is something that our frontline practitioners are dealing with, often on a daily basis, and really struggling to put into protections and supports that people need. So again, for me, I think there is a broad consensus and agreement from all key stakeholders here in Ireland that we need additional protections and we need primary safeguarding legislation to ensure the protection and upholding of human rights within that context of protection and support. Okay, so getting on to the issue of social isolation, loneliness, and how this impacts on health, both physical and mental health. So again, the World Health Organization have really kind of focused in on this in recent years and have talked about 1 in 4 older people experience social isolation. And again, across the last 2 days, we've heard many presentations around that negative impact in terms of serious impacts on physical and mental health, quality of life, longevity, increasing the risk of dementia, increasing risk of early death. And again, the impact on mortality, it's been argued, is comparable to other well-established risk factors, whether that's smoking, obesity, or indeed physical activity. Again, we know that sustained disadvantage over the life course, those are more likely to become socially excluded, and those adverse health and well-being outcomes can result in long-term illness, disability, psychological distress, lower quality of life, unmet care needs, and also increased risk of loneliness. But again, we have seen some kind of developments at the level of the UN. So the United Nations General Assembly declared 2021 to 2030 the UN Decade of Healthy Ageing, and within that they very much set out to reduce some of these health inequalities under 4 target areas. The first, I think really important, are attitudes, so that commitment to change how we think, how we feel, and how we act towards age and ageism. Secondly, that we develop communities. So again, we're seeing that kind of intergenerational solidarity life course approach in terms of we need to foster and develop the abilities of our older people. Thirdly, to deliver person-centred integrated care and primary health services. And again, I think here in Ireland we are making good progress in that area with lots of positive developments. However, the fourth commitment is also around the need to provide older people who need it with access to quality long-term care. And again, in this context, they're talking about home care and nursing home care. And again, I would argue we have some way to go there. I suppose, underpinning all of this argument, it's really important to focus on the whole issue of connections. We are hardwired for connection, and again, the Harvard study of adult development, which my understanding is this is the longest longitudinal study that we have globally around age and ageing. Really, the strongest indicator coming out of that is our relationships and how happy we are in our relationships. That has the biggest impact on our health. And again, this is a positive. That doesn't cost money. It's cost neutral, but it's something that we can foster and develop. So those close relationships, more than money, celebrity, anything else, are what is going to keep us really happy and keep us well. And they're better predictors of long and happy lives in either social class, IQ, or indeed even genetics. Okay, but moving on to the Irish context, and rightly or wrongly, the European Union has identified us as the loneliest country in Europe from some of its recent work. And again, I think this figure is quite stark in terms of 20% of people in Ireland feeling lonely most or all of the time, which is quite striking when we compare that to 13% across the European Union. Again, indications that people who feel lonely are 6 times more likely to experience mental health issues, but also negative impacts in terms of raises mortality risk by 26%, social isolation by 29%, and living alone by 32%. Family Carers of Ireland have also done some work in this area, and their State of Caring report in 2024 indicated that almost half, 48% of all carers experience severe loneliness. So again, we cannot have this conversation without thinking about that cohort of people. Again, I think also important to kind of reflect on almost 70% of all supports currently that have been developed to address loneliness are in the community and voluntary sector, and also that most efforts at the moment are targeted at older people rather than younger people. So again, I think that very much needs to be broadened out. But we have also seen some important commitments and developments there. In terms of 2018, the Loneliness Task Force was established, which is very much a collective of a number of NGOs, individuals, and again I would say that Alone and Sean Moynihan have been playing a blinder in terms of really bringing this issue to the fore, to the general public, very much advocating for dedicated funding in this budget, which I don't actually know if that was granted or not, Aileen, but also kind of recognising that, yeah, loneliness is an issue for older people, but again, emerging research, also family carers, young people, people of ethnic minorities, and also pregnant women. So again, something that we really need to kind of address. Okay, so moving on now into more of the care realm, and really I wanted to look at the whole issue of complexity of caregiving in later life and some of the issues that our frontline practitioners and policymakers and researchers are really grappling with currently. So we know that elder abuse can be a continuation of harm that began in earlier years. So again, for people who experience maybe child abuse or domestic violence in earlier life are much likelier to experience elder abuse in later life. We also know that cumulative impact of advantage or disadvantage over the life course can heighten and broaden some of those health inequalities that I talked about earlier. But also the increase in care needs. So for example, if we think about a person living with dementia and their family caregiver, often when those intimate care needs develop, that can be a trigger for, I suppose, increased risk of harm or abuse. And again, I think important to recognise that that can be bidirectional. Again, we know that inadequate service responses can also perpetuate and aggravate harmful and abusive situations, but also create conditions where abuse and harm can emerge. So situations where an older person and their family caregiver have little or no support, the carers experience huge amounts of caregiver burden, and really that this heightens the risk of carers intentionally or unintentionally harming the person they're supporting. However, we also have an emerging area of practice and research, and I'll talk about this a little bit more, is the whole issue. And again, this is incredibly taboo, it's incredibly sensitive, and I suppose I'm trying to use today to open up the conversation and heighten awareness about this, and that is the topic of carers who are harmed by the person they're caring for. In this context, I'm talking about unintentional harm, so perhaps situations, say for example, where a person with dementia is exhibiting behavioural and psychological symptoms of dementia, is maybe lashing out, and the caregiver is being hurt in that context. And I suppose within that, I'm going to go back to care harm, but I wanted to kind of focus on care and support for older people and what we do have and some of the challenges around that. I was very fortunate to be invited to present to the Commission on Care for Older Persons over the summer, and they specifically wanted me to present on a home care study that I carried out way back in 2015 with the Irish Association of Social Workers, with Age Action, and with the Alzheimer's Society of Ireland. And I would say it's probably the piece of research I'm proudest of to date that I did, because we had no money. I was straight out of Tala Hospital into academia, and as Mary Dixon Woods talked about this morning, I was kind of an honest broker in that for the first time I could kind of speak to some of the issues that I'd witnessed in practice. When I was kind of reviewing and preparing for the presentation with the Commission of Care, I was struck by how little has been done in terms of research on home care and home care provision since then, but I was also struck by how little has changed. So look, there have been improvements. We absolutely have more access to home care funding, but there are significant difficulties and challenges currently in terms of our care and support systems. Firstly, we heard the word equity numerous times over the last few days. There is no equity of access to services. There's a lack of transparency about entitlement to services, and again, a huge postcode lottery. So depending on where you live, your geographical location, for me, I think those in rural areas are probably more negatively impacted with demand far outstripping supply. And the issue we really have now, like when I was in practice, the issue was there was no money. The issue now is there is funding, but we do not have the home care workforce that we need to fill those home care hours. And again, we have to ask the question, why is this type of work so poorly paid, but also so poorly valued? So we really need to look at the working conditions of our home care workforce and making this an attractive, because it's such valuable work that we need people to, and we need our government to invest in that. Aligned with that, we also have a time-to-task delivery of care. So again, we've seen a shift to maybe 15-minute calls, half-hour calls, and I would argue, how can any care be delivered with any type of dignity or respect for the older person in that time period? Again, it doesn't allow for relationship building, it doesn't allow for companionship, all of which would help with some of that social isolation and loneliness. So it's a little bit of a perfect storm in that respect. We also know that care packages do not always meet the individual needs of our older people. So again, I'll go back to the needs of people living with dementia in terms of often their needs are not around physical care needs, it might be supervisory support needs. And I suppose ultimately this can then accumulate and end up in the situation of unnecessary or premature admission to long-term residential care. I mean, we also have significant issues around our our respite, and that ability to access respite in a timely and preventative way. So look, I think lots to think about there as well. In terms of care harm, and again, I feel like I'm going kind of down a little bit of a negative route, but I feel it's really, really important to highlight this. This is very sensitive, this is very taboo. Family carers do not proactively come forward and talk about the harm that they are being exposed to. I've only recently, developed an understanding of this area. I was very fortunate to get some funding from the Irish Research Council. So in 2022, we did a small piece of qualitative research looking at family carers of people living with dementia and carers of children and adults with autism. And really one of the most striking findings was the huge stigma, shame and guilt that is associated with this type of harm. People don't want to speak out. They don't often recognise that these behaviours are harmful because it's so firmly embedded, and I suppose that protection of our family lives. But also, I suppose, the fear of speaking out, the fear of unwanted care or indeed unwanted criminal interventions, which I'll give an indication to about in a moment. I mean, my motivation to look at this really was spurred on by an earlier study done by my good colleague Dr. Deirdre O'Donnell from UCD in conjunction with Family Carers Ireland and the College of Psychiatrists of Ireland in 2019, where they surveyed 1,102 family carers, 44% of whom reported regularly experiencing physical, verbal and or emotional harm from the person they were caring for. So look, we do have evidence emerging about this. I'm doing work with colleagues across the 5 nations in the British Isles because really, you know, there's definitely consensus that this is poorly understood, poorly researched, but a real issue for our frontline practitioners. Okay, So I want to read you Mairead's story. Mairead was a family care of a person living with dementia, her dad, and this was Mairead's experience in terms of some of what I've talked about. There was an incident when a carer was hurt, so it was just the 2 carers in the room at the time, so the 2 professional carers. You know, so obviously we weren't there to see what happened. A carer got injured, and then the next day at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, I got a phone call from the manager of services for older persons advising me that care had been withdrawn with immediate effect from my dad. She advised that there was a physical assault within the home, that he needed a psychiatric assessment, and it wasn't safe for her employees to be coming into the home, and that we could also expect a call from the Gardaí. So in this situation, not only was the care immediately withdrawn, leaving Mairead and her 80-year-old mother to care for her father, who needed 2 for transfers, was quite heavily dependent, but there was also a report made to the Gardaí around the assault on the professional carers. So again, I would ask the question, our paid carers are protected from abuse and harm by law, but our family carers currently are not. And really, for me, older people and their carers have a right to be protected from harm and abuse and to live a life without fear from this. And I suppose within this, part of this discourse is the whole issue of what we might call dangerous care, but also systems that harm. So systems that harm, I'm referring to harm caused or indeed exacerbated by that lack of services and how healthcare professionals sometimes engage with older people. So again, some of the carers we talked about having to beg, fight for help, being made to feel undeserving, made to feel like there was people much worse than them and that they should be entitled to the care. Again, that huge issue of double standards that we saw around Mairead's example in terms of the right to protection for those paid carers versus what the family carers were expected to deal with. But I think on the other side, and this is probably where some of yourselves are at, there is a huge amount of professional helplessness and frustration. And for many of the professionals we talked to, they were really heartbroken about their inability to respond to the families and older people they were working with, or to put in place any supports or services, even in quite crisis situations. And again, we've seen some really nice work come out of Scotland in terms of the whole concept of dangerous care, which can be defined as care that harm that might occur between individuals, but also how welfare policy and service delivery can both create and aggravate the stresses within such relationships, but also our responses to these. For me, what's helpful, I think, is really moving towards, as I said, that more recognition that we are all interdependent. And while, yes, absolutely, we need to uphold individual rights, we also need to look at collective rights and the balancing of rights. And I think the ethics of care approach is helpful in this respect, in terms of recognising interdependency and relation autonomy through those caregiving relationships. And I think Lloyd's quote sums it up very nicely in terms of, from the perspective of the ethic of care, the discourse of burdensomeness is a way of marginalising older people, but also disassociating the young, fit and able-bodied from their own vulnerability and from their future old age. And look, I don't have research around this, but I do think there is something about our own uncomfortableness with our own ageing, and also that thought that we might need care support or be disabled in some respect going forward. So I think we really need to have a shared understanding of our vulnerabilities, but also that we may in time need care ourselves. Because again, I think vulnerability is a very contested term. Often it is associated with age, with a particular personal characteristic, whereas in fact I would argue that any of us may be vulnerable. It tends to be contextual, and depending on a certain set of circumstances, we may find ourselves vulnerable and in need of care and support. Okay, nearly there. So I'm aware this has been quite heavy. We've been looking at some of our challenges, but I think now is time to really look at solutions. And for me, this is kind of our call to arms as I finish up today. So firstly, I've talked about the importance and the need for a UN Convention for Older People. I think this is absolutely paramount, and what that will do is, it is a legal, hard law that we can hold our government and other jurisdictions to account in terms of the human rights of older people. The Alliance of Age Sectors, NGOs here in Ireland, has repeatedly called for an independent commissioner for ageing and older people. We have one in the north of Ireland, we have one in Scotland. I would absolutely argue that we need that here too. And again, what this would bring is, it would be, I suppose, an identified person who can give voice to all the many issues for our older people from our advocacy organisations. So that central point, again, a person who can hold the government accountable. But I also think we really need to think about reframing ageing and challenging societal attitudes, and really looking at our own attitudes, but also the need for education and awareness raising around age and ageism. And within that, I think really important that we begin to build intergenerational solidarity. And one really useful mechanism for this is the whole issue of intergenerational friendship and fostering that. And my colleague, Dr. Catherine Elliott O'Dare, has really done, she's based in Trinity College, has done some pioneering work in this area. And again, this is cost neutral. It doesn't impact on our finances in such a way. However, I do believe we absolutely need to routinely move to an integrated assessment of needs. So when we are assessing the needs of an older person, we are also routinely assessing the needs of our caregivers. And look, I think that probably is happening in an informal way, but I think that needs to be formalised. So for example, in the UK, under the Care Act 2014, if a person is deemed to have care and support needs, their family carer or their designated nominated carer also has a legislative right to an assessment of need. My understanding is our Interrail single assessment tool does incorporate this, but I'm not quite clear where we are at in terms of the rollout of that, and is that being routinely administered to all older people. Maybe that's a point for discussion later on. However, I do have a note of caution. Assessment is really important, but without a legislative underpinning to supports and services, that ultimately is going to be futile. And again, I still find it hard to articulate and understand how citizens of Ireland have a legislative entitlement to nursing home care, but we still do not have our statutory home care scheme. Again, there have been calls from this from the early 80s, again in the 2000s, and we are still awaiting that, and I don't know when we're likely to see that. What we can also do, and again, I think this is cost neutral, something we can all get involved in, is collective action in terms of speaking out about these issues, and also collective advocacy. So bringing everyone together, ourselves, our older people, our advocacy organisations, our policymakers, and really giving voice to the issues that we need to see change around, and also the funding required to do that. So my concluding thought for today is really the reframing of care and support of older people as a collective responsibility and a public good can help to put in place the policies and resources that we need not only for our current generation of older people, but also for our future older selves. So other than that, just thank you so much for listening, and I'm happy to try and answer any questions.
Sarah, thank you very much for this comprehensive and thought-provoking lecture. In particular, I trust that your call for arms at the end provided hope and also some direction towards practical future steps that all of us could take in order to safeguard human rights and grow old with dignity. So any questions for Sarah now?
Thank you so much, Sarah. That was absolutely just amazing. What a finish to the meeting. I just want to ask, older adults themselves also kind of have ageist beliefs about themselves, and you can see it all the time that they're really they're more likely to advocate for their grandchildren to get education, climate change, than they are for themselves. Is there anything that we can do about that? They just don't seem to be as people kind of advocating for themselves, but they'll advocate for everyone else kind of around them, their own families.
I think it's a really important question, Emer, and it's something I've wondered about myself, because I think since we haven't really seen our older people get out en masse about any issues since they tried to remove the medical card many, many years ago. That was the last time there was kind of a mass revolt. So I do think there is something about mobilising our older people, creating kind of mechanisms for them to come together around shared issues. But I think there's also an education and awareness raising piece, and that's not only for our older people, but I think we need to really start earlier in terms of our younger generation, so that some of those internalised beliefs about age and ageing are kind of counteracted. As I said, intergenerational friendship and other intergenerational based activities will also really help with that in terms of, I suppose, minimising or challenging some of those negative stereotypes. And again, that doesn't cost any money, but we kind of need to create mechanisms to do that.
Very good. Any other questions?
Karina.
So you're coming at this from the perspective of a human rights perspective, which oftentimes it's kind of missing from our kind of more day-to-day narrative. So to what extent is that leveraging more of a response from a political stance, or?
It's a good question, Karina. I'm not sure it is. And I think, again, I think that's why the need for UN Convention is so critically important, because without that, it's very, very difficult to leverage any real meaningful change, I think, in terms of human rights. I think what we can do, again, in terms of the context of our older people, is there is many older people do not, to claim your human rights, you have to know what your human rights are. And again, I think for many of our older people, particularly those in nursing homes, do not have a voice, do not understand what rights they should be entitled to. So again, I think there is an education and awareness raising piece around that.
Thank you, Sarah. Any other question? We have time for one more. I
think everyone wants to go home, Viviana, at this stage.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Viviana. Thank you.